I recently experienced the worst moment of my life in my garden. Like a carpet of ecological devastation, I was confronted with 10,000 dead bees, their bodies shriveled and immobile from illegal pesticide poisoning. Someone had made the biggest mistake of suburban life. They thought they were eliminating pesky insects. Little did they realize they were waging war on a CDC disease researcher who spends his days tracking environmental toxins that are destroying entire ecosystems. Picture this: 6:45 a.m., perfect Georgia morning in Meadowbrook Estates, and I'm stepping out for my daily hive inspection, coffee steaming in the humid air, when I discover what can only be described as an environmental crime scene. The smell of chemical death mixed with honeysuckle and the devastating silence where 50,000 bees should have been humming with productive life. My research colonies, critical to understanding pollinator collapse and its connection to emerging diseases, reduced to toxic casualties by someone who thought they had authority over federal environmental research. What would you do if someone poisoned your life's work and potentially endangered an entire community's food security? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I guarantee some of you have dealt with chemical-obsessed neighbors who think pesticides solve everything, even when they're committing federal environmental crimes. Let me back up and tell you how a CDC disease investigator ended up at war with suburban eco-terrorists. Because this story starts with understanding the delicate balance between human health and environmental systems, and ends with the kind of federal justice that only environmental crimes prosecution can deliver. My name is Dr. Sarah Kim, and 2 years before this Beehive massacre, I was sitting in the CDC's Atlanta headquarters analyzing disease outbreak patterns when I discovered something that would change my entire research focus. Emerging infectious diseases weren't just jumping from animals to humans randomly. They were following predictable patterns that correlated directly with environmental disruption and pollinator population collapse. My specialty at the Centers for Disease Control is environmental epidemiology, tracking how ecosystem destruction creates conditions for disease emergence and spread. I'd spent 15 years investigating everything from West Nile virus outbreaks to antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but the Beehive research represented something entirely new. Understanding how pollinator collapse might trigger cascading public health emergencies that could affect millions of Americans. The connection between bee health and human disease seemed obscure until you understood the science. Pollinators maintain plant diversity that produces natural compounds essential for human immune system function. When bee populations collapse, plant communities simplify, reducing the complex chemical environments that help human bodies resist emerging pathogens. My research was documenting how pollinator loss in agricultural areas correlated with increased rates of respiratory disease, immune deficiency, and antibiotic resistance. The CDC had approved my proposal for residential beehive research colonies that would allow me to study pollinator health in suburban environments while investigating how urban pesticide use might be accelerating the kind of ecological disruption that creates perfect conditions for disease emergence. The research wasn't just academic. It was critical infrastructure for understanding how environmental crimes against pollinators might be creating the next pandemic. But studying bees meant more than scientific research. Growing up in my grandmother's garden in rural South Korea, I'd learned that beekeeping was both art and science, requiring patience, observation, and deep respect for creatures whose survival determined human food security. Every bee colony was a complex society whose health reflected the environmental conditions that affected every living thing in the ecosystem. When I moved to Meadowbrook Estates, a beautiful Georgia community that balanced suburban comfort with rural character, establishing my research hives seemed like perfect integration of professional mission and personal passion. The property came with 2 acres of diverse flowering plants, ideal foraging habitat for bee colonies, and neighbors who initially seemed to appreciate both the environmental benefits and the scientific importance of pollinator research. My 5 research hives were state-of-the-art installations designed for both productive beekeeping and precise scientific monitoring. Each colony was equipped with sensors that tracked population health, honey production, foraging patterns, and environmental exposure indicators that helped me understand how suburban chemical use affected pollinator behavior and survival. The data was transmitted directly to CDC databases, where it contributed to national pollinator health surveillance. The colonies thrived in Georgia's climate, producing exceptional honey while providing crucial pollination services for the entire neighborhood's gardens and food plants. My bees were responsible for increased fruit production in dozens of backyard gardens, improved wildflower diversity throughout the community, and educational opportunities for local schools learning about ecosystem interconnection and environmental stewardship. For 18 months, the research proceeded exactly as planned. The bee colonies demonstrated remarkable health and productivity. The scientific data revealed important insights about suburban pollinator management, and community members regularly stopped by to learn about beekeeping while sampling honey that represented the purest expression of our local ecosystem's health and diversity. I should have known that peace wouldn't last. It never does when ignorant people mistake environmental destruction for pest control and ecological crimes for community improvement. Enter Margaret Thompson, 58 years old, HOA Environmental Standards, committee chairwoman for 2 consecutive terms, and the kind of woman who treats pesticide application like holy war against any insect that dares exist in her perfectly controlled suburban environment. Picture someone who considers chemical warfare against nature, a homeowner's patriotic duty, and natural ecosystems a personal affront to property values. Margaret had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 18 months earlier from a sterile subdivision in suburban Atlanta, bringing with her an arsenal of chemical products and an obsession with eliminating every form of insect life that bordered on environmental psychosis. She'd systematically transformed our naturally balanced community into a chemical wasteland where beneficial insects couldn't survive and natural pest control collapsed completely. Margaret's first encounter with my research bees happened during one of her weekly pesticide application sessions, where she documented every insect sighting like a military intelligence officer planning bombing campaigns against biodiversity. She was spraying her roses with banned organophosphates when she noticed my bees foraging in her flower beds, apparently unaware that pollinators were supposed to visit flowers. The violation notice arrived within 24 hours, delivered with the kind of toxic authority usually reserved for environmental criminals and ecological terrorists. I found it taped to my research hive installations, a formal document that transformed life-saving scientific research into community pest management problems and federal environmental work into neighborhood compliance issues. Notice of Pest Management Covenant Violation, the document proclaimed in bold letters that made my CDC credentials irrelevant and 15 years of environmental health research meaningless. Unauthorized insect harboring creates pest infestation risks and violates Article 12, Section 7 of Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Covenants regarding appropriate pest control maintenance and community safety standards. The violation demanded immediate removal of all bee colonies within 14 days, or face escalating fines starting at $500 daily, plus mandatory professional pest control treatment of the entire property to eliminate what Margaret classified as dangerous insect infestation threatening community health and safety. I read the violation notice 3 times, my scientific training warring with disbelief, as I processed how someone could classify essential pollinators as pest infestations and demand destruction of federal environmental research in the name of community safety. The epidemiologist in me recognized profound ecological ignorance, but the beekeeper in me felt personal violation of something sacred. Instead of responding immediately, I spent that evening researching Margaret's background and discovering environmental destruction patterns that revealed systematic ecological crimes disguised as pest management. Property records showed she'd been cited by the Georgia Department of Agriculture for illegal pesticide use, fined by the EPA for wetlands violations, and investigated by the Fish and Wildlife Service for systematic habitat destruction. Margaret wasn't just an ignorant homeowner making bad chemical choices. She was a habitual environmental criminal whose suburban pest control activities violated multiple federal laws while creating exactly the kind of ecological disruption that my CDC research was designed to understand and prevent. The next morning, I called my supervisor at the CDC, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in environmental health policy and had overseen the approval process for my residential research colonies. Jennifer's response was immediate and decisive, the kind of federal authority that transforms local harassment into serious criminal investigation. Sarah, she said, her voice carrying 20 years of environmental health enforcement experience, what you're describing isn't just HOA harassment, it's potential interference with federal public health research and systematic violation of environmental protection laws. We need to document everything and consider whether criminal prosecution is necessary to protect critical scientific work. Jennifer connected me with Robert Chen, an environmental crimes attorney who specialized in prosecuting violations of federal pollution laws and had built his career destroying people who thought suburban location exempted them from environmental criminal liability. Robert's track record included successful federal prosecutions of individuals who'd committed environmental crimes while hiding behind community authority and property rights. Dr. Kim, Robert explained during our consultation, your Beehive situation falls under multiple federal protections: scientific research interference, environmental crimes prosecution, and potential public health endangerment all provide grounds for serious criminal charges against anyone who interferes with CDC-approved environmental health research through illegal chemical applications. Robert's analysis revealed that Margaret's violation notice wasn't just community harassment, it was potential federal obstruction of scientific research combined with systematic environmental crimes that could result in prison sentences and substantial financial penalties. My bee colonies weren't just personal property. They were federal research infrastructure deserving protection under laws that Margaret clearly didn't understand. But the legal protections were just the beginning. Robert explained that federal environmental law included enhanced penalties for systematic violations, pattern recognition that could transform individual chemical misuse into organized criminal enterprise deserving prosecution under environmental racketeering statutes that carried mandatory prison sentences and asset forfeiture. Armed with legal knowledge and growing determination to protect both my research and community environmental health, I decided to give Margaret one opportunity to retreat before I introduced her to the federal court system, where environmental criminals face serious consequences for ecological destruction disguised as pest management. I requested a meeting with the HOA board to discuss my Beehive research and explain the federal protections that made interference with CDC work a serious criminal matter. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, where Margaret presided over environmental discussions like some suburban Supreme Court justice dispensing ecological wisdom to residents who dared question her chemical authority. The meeting room filled with neighbors who'd benefited from my bees' pollination services, many bringing samples of improved fruit and vegetable harvests that demonstrated the economic and nutritional benefits of supporting rather than destroying local pollinator populations. Margaret controlled the discussion with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced serious opposition to her interpretation of environmental management. Dr. Kim, she began, consulting her clipboard like it contained EPA regulations instead of suburban paranoia. Your unauthorized insect colonies create pest management risks that threaten community health and safety. Personal research interests don't override our responsibility to maintain appropriate pest control standards that protect everyone's property values and family welfare. I stood up slowly, the way I did when addressing CDC leadership, about matters of public health, emergency, and federal research protection. Margaret, I said, my voice carrying 15 years of environmental health authority, my bee colonies aren't pest infestations. They're CDC-approved research installations critical to understanding pollinator collapse and its connection to emerging disease patterns. Federal law prohibits interference with environmental health research, especially through illegal chemical applications. Margaret's confident expression flickered like contaminated laboratory equipment with power supply problems. But her chemical warfare programming ran too deep to acknowledge ecological reality easily. Dr. Kim, environmental research doesn't exempt property owners from community pest management requirements. We maintain safety standards that apply equally to all residents regardless of professional activities or federal employment status. I opened my folder and began reading from the federal statutes that were about to transform Margaret's ecological crimes into serious criminal liability. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act prohibits application of banned pesticides in residential areas. The Endangered Species Act protects pollinators from systematic chemical destruction. The Clean Water Act prevents toxic runoff from illegal pesticide applications. Any interference with federal environmental research through banned chemical use constitutes serious federal crimes. The room fell silent as federal environmental law invaded Margaret's comfortable world of chemical pest control and ecological destruction. Several neighbors began sharing stories about improved garden productivity since my bees had arrived, while others expressed concern about chemical contamination from Margaret's excessive pesticide applications throughout the community. Margaret doubled down with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview depended on chemical solutions to ecological problems she'd created through previous chemical applications. Federal laws don't override private community safety requirements, she insisted, apparently believing Suburban location exempted her from environmental criminal liability. Homeowner associations maintain the right to enforce pest management standards that protect residents from dangerous insect infestations, regardless of individual research projects or federal oversight. I smiled with the kind of scientific patience I developed while explaining environmental health concepts to people who preferred chemical warfare to ecological understanding. Margaret, federal environmental law specifically prohibits exactly what you're planning. My bee colonies are federally protected research infrastructure. Any chemical interference with CDC research constitutes environmental crimes that carry substantial criminal penalties, including prison sentences and financial forfeiture. The community center atmosphere shifted as residents realized they were watching federal environmental law confront suburban chemical obsession in real time. Margaret's supporters looked increasingly uncomfortable, while neighbors who'd benefited from pollinator services began speaking up about the ecological and economic value of protecting rather than destroying beneficial insect populations. Frank Morrison, a retired biology teacher, stood up and addressed Margaret directly. "Those bees pollinated my tomato garden better than it's produced in 20 years. Dr. Kim's research is helping our entire community understand how to work with nature instead of poisoning everything that moves. You want to destroy scientific work that's benefiting everyone? That's not pest management, that's ecological vandalism." Margaret's final mistake was escalating instead of retreating from what had clearly become a losing battle against federal environmental law and community ecological awareness. "Dr. Kim," she said, her voice rising with the kind of chemical desperation that reveals underlying environmental psychosis, "the HOA board will proceed with pest management enforcement regardless of your federal theories. Community safety must be maintained, and your bee colonies violate multiple pest control requirements that demand immediate correction." "Margaret," I replied, my voice quiet enough to make everyone lean forward to hear the words that would end her ecological terrorism forever. "You just committed federal conspiracy to obstruct environmental health research while planning banned pesticide applications. I want to thank you for making the environmental crimes case so much easier to prosecute in federal court." But Margaret's education about federal environmental law was just beginning. That weekend, while I was reviewing pollinator research data and preparing federal crime reports, Margaret made the decision that would transform simple HOA harassment into federal environmental felonies, deserving substantial prison time. She hired a professional pest control company to chemically treat my property while I was at the CDC analyzing disease outbreak patterns, apparently believing she could eliminate my research colonies before federal law could protect scientifically critical pollinator populations. The chemical application occurred at dawn on Tuesday morning, using banned organophosphate pesticides that killed everything within a quarter-mile radius. My neighbor David Martinez called me at CDC headquarters at 8:15 a.m., his voice shaking with ecological horror and disbelief. "Dr. Kim," he said, "there are dead bees everywhere. Your entire yard is covered with poisoned insects. Margaret hired exterminators to spray your property with chemicals, so toxic they're wearing hazmat suits and warning everyone to stay indoors." I immediately contacted the CDC's Environmental Health Emergency Response Team, requesting immediate hazmat investigation and evidence collection for potential federal environmental crimes prosecution. But by the time federal investigators arrived at my Meadowbrook property, Margaret's chemical warfare had created an ecological disaster that would haunt my dreams and fuel my determination to seek maximum criminal penalties. The scene I discovered when I arrived from CDC headquarters was beyond environmental destruction. It was ecological genocide. 10,000 dead bees carpeting my backyard like victims of chemical warfare. My 5 research colonies completely destroyed, along with beneficial insects throughout the entire neighborhood. 2 years of critical scientific data eliminated by someone who understood neither pollinator importance nor federal environmental law. The chemical analysis revealed illegal pesticide applications that violated every federal environmental protection statute while creating toxic contamination that would require hazmat cleanup and community health monitoring. Margaret had used compounds banned by the EPA for over a decade, chemicals so dangerous they required federal criminal investigation and potential public health emergency declaration. The federal investigation began immediately, with EPA agents treating Margaret's actions as environmental crimes requiring prosecution under federal statutes that enhanced penalties for systematic ecological destruction and interference with federal research. Special Agent Maria Santos from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division understood both environmental law and the serious consequences for chemical terrorism disguised as pest management. Dr. Kim, she explained during our initial interview, what happened here isn't pest control. It's environmental terrorism involving destruction of federal research infrastructure, illegal application of banned pesticides, and creation of public health hazards that threaten an entire community. Mrs. Thompson's actions qualify for maximum penalties under federal environmental crimes statutes. The federal investigation expanded beyond Margaret's individual crimes to examine Meadowbrook Estate's institutional failures in preventing environmental destruction and systematic chemical violations throughout the community. The HOA had enabled Margaret's ecological terrorism by refusing to provide environmental oversight, rejecting federal research protections, and maintaining policies that encouraged rather than prevented chemical crimes by community officials. Agent Santos revealed that federal prosecutors were considering charges under environmental racketeering statutes, treating Margaret's systematic pesticide violations as criminal enterprise designed to profit from chemical sales while systematically destroying beneficial insect populations that competed with her pest control ideology. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who'd benefited from my bees' pollination services were horrified to learn that Margaret had destroyed scientific research while creating toxic contamination that threatened children, pets, and beneficial wildlife throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Margaret Walsh organized a memorial service for my destroyed research colonies, where over 200 residents shared stories about improved garden productivity and learned about pollinator importance to food security and ecosystem stability. The gathering became both celebration of scientific research and condemnation of Margaret's environmental crimes against community welfare. Frank Morrison started a legal defense fund to support my federal prosecution of Margaret's environmental crimes, attracting contributions from environmental organizations throughout Georgia who recognized the broader implications of prosecuting suburban chemical terrorism. The fund raised over $75,000 within 2 weeks, demonstrating statewide support for holding environmental criminals accountable through maximum federal penalties. The media coverage began locally, but expanded to national attention as my Beehives story captured public interest in pollinator protection, environmental crimes prosecution, and scientific research defense against suburban chemical obsession. The coverage framed Margaret's actions as criminal assault on both environmental health and scientific progress. Margaret's response to growing legal pressure was predictably desperate and environmentally destructive, guaranteeing additional federal charges and longer prison sentences. Faced with federal environmental crimes, prosecution, and community-wide condemnation, she escalated her chemical warfare in ways that demonstrated clear criminal intent and environmental terrorism. Margaret began threatening witnesses who'd cooperated with federal environmental investigators, leaving voicemail messages warning residents about economic consequences of supporting federal prosecution against Community Chemical Management Authority. Each message violated federal witness intimidation laws while providing additional evidence for prosecutors building their environmental terrorism case. The document destruction escalated when Margaret realized her chemical purchase records contained damning evidence of systematic banned pesticide acquisition and application that violated federal environmental laws. She attempted to destroy receipts, application logs, and correspondence with illegal chemical suppliers who'd provided restricted compounds for residential use. Federal investigators had already obtained duplicate records from chemical suppliers during their evidence collection phase, making Margaret's destruction attempts both futile and criminally stupid. Each act of evidence destruction added new federal obstruction charges while demonstrating consciousness of guilt that environmental crimes prosecutors love presenting to juries. Margaret's final mistake was attempting to flee Georgia when she realized federal environmental charges were imminent, and her chemical terrorism had guaranteed substantial prison time. She loaded her SUV with cash, chemical application equipment, and restricted pesticides, then drove toward the Tennessee border like some suburban eco-terrorist attempting to establish new chemical warfare operations in a different jurisdiction. Georgia State Police arrested Margaret at a border checkpoint with over $40,000 in cash, illegal pesticide stockpiles that violated federal transportation laws, and detailed plans for establishing chemical application services in Tennessee, communities without environmental oversight. Her flight attempt added additional federal charges while confirming criminal intent regarding the Beehive destruction. The federal indictment was unsealed on a crisp October morning that reminded me of autumn days when healthy bee colonies prepare for winter survival through natural processes Margaret had criminally disrupted. United States versus Margaret Ann Thompson included 19 federal charges ranging from environmental terrorism to obstruction of justice, with potential sentences totaling over 35 years in federal prison. The charges detailed Margaret's systematic environmental crimes that had targeted federal research while creating public health hazards affecting hundreds of families throughout Meadowbrook Estates. The indictment read like an environmental crimes textbook, with Margaret's own chemical purchase records providing evidence of her terrorist intent and systematic ecological destruction. The federal trial was scheduled for spring, but the environmental crimes prosecution provided immediate protection for pollinator research and community environmental health. Federal Judge Robert Martinez issued comprehensive injunctive relief prohibiting further illegal pesticide applications, while requiring complete environmental remediation of chemical contamination Margaret had created throughout the community. Judge Martinez's orders were thorough and permanent, protecting not just my rebuilt research colonies, but establishing precedent that would prevent similar environmental crimes against scientific research throughout Georgia. The federal court specifically recognized pollinator research as critical infrastructure deserving enhanced protection under environmental crime statutes. The preliminary injunction also included broader environmental protections for Meadowbrook residents, requiring HOA compliance with federal environmental laws while prohibiting chemical applications that violated EPA regulations. Margaret's crimes had resulted in court-ordered environmental reforms that would protect every resident from similar chemical terrorism. But the most satisfying aspect of the federal environmental intervention was the financial impact on Margaret personally. Judge Martinez ruled that Margaret's environmental crimes had caused substantial ecological damage and research destruction, awarding damages that included colony replacement costs, research data recreation, environmental cleanup expenses, and punitive damages designed to deter future environmental terrorism. The monetary award was followed by restitution provisions that made Margaret personally liable for all costs of environmental remediation and scientific research reconstruction. Federal environmental law includes cost recovery provisions that require environmental criminals to pay for ecosystem restoration, transforming Margaret's chemical terrorism into expensive lessons about respecting federal environmental protection. The criminal trial opened 10 months after Margaret had destroyed my research colonies, in the same Atlanta federal court where environmental criminals face serious consequences for ecological destruction. The prosecution was led by United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a former environmental prosecutor who understood both federal environmental law and the enhanced penalties for systematic ecological crimes. The trial evidence included recordings of Margaret's chemical terrorism planning, purchase records documenting banned pesticide acquisition, and expert testimony from dozens of environmental scientists explaining the ecological and public health consequences of systematic pollinator destruction through illegal chemical applications. My testimony was particularly powerful describing the scientific importance of pollinator research and the environmental devastation Margaret had criminally created. I wore my CDC identification while testifying, representing both personal loss and federal institutional commitment to environmental health research that Margaret had systematically attacked through chemical terrorism. The jury listened with obvious sympathy and growing environmental awareness as I described finding 10,000 dead bees carpeting my research area like victims of ecological warfare. My testimony transformed Margaret's actions from pest control into environmental terrorism that threatened both scientific progress and community ecological stability. The defense strategy was pathetic in its environmental ignorance and insulting in its assumptions about federal environmental law. Margaret's attorney attempted to portray her chemical applications as good faith pest management by a concerned homeowner protecting community safety from dangerous insect infestations. The defense argument collapsed when prosecutors presented chemical analysis proving Margaret had used compounds banned specifically because they cause mass pollinator death, ecosystem destruction, and public health hazards. Her systematic acquisition and application of illegal pesticides eliminated any possibility of claiming innocent pest management or legitimate community protection. Margaret's testimony in her own defense was a masterpiece of environmental self-destruction that sealed her fate while revealing the depth of her chemical obsession and ecological terrorism. She spent 2 days attempting to justify systematic environmental crimes while demonstrating the anti-ecological ideology underlying her systematic chemical warfare against beneficial insects. When Prosecutor Walsh asked Margaret to explain why she'd targeted my research bees specifically, her response revealed the environmental terrorism that had motivated her chemical destruction campaign. Suburban communities need to understand that federal research doesn't exempt property owners from pest management requirements that protect families from dangerous insect infestations, she said, displaying exactly the kind of ecological ignorance that federal environmental law exists to punish severely. The jury deliberation lasted less than 3 hours, barely enough time to review environmental evidence and complete paperwork for guilty verdicts on all 19 federal charges. The foreman, a retired agricultural extension agent who understood both pollinator importance and environmental protection necessity, delivered the verdicts with environmental authority while staring directly at Margaret throughout the entire reading. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 8 weeks after conviction, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation and victim impact statements from environmental scientists, community residents, and agricultural organizations affected by Margaret's systematic environmental crimes. The Federal Probation Office recommended 22 years in prison, complete environmental remediation costs, and lifetime supervision following release from federal custody. The victim impact statements provided opportunity for environmental advocates to address federal court directly about ecological harm caused by Margaret's systematic chemical terrorism. I chose to speak for pollinator conservation and scientific research protection, representing both personal loss and broader environmental health implications of prosecuting ecological crimes. Your Honor, I began, wearing my CDC credentials and speaking with environmental authority earned through 15 years of ecological health research. Margaret Thompson didn't just destroy my bee colonies, she committed environmental terrorism against critical scientific research while creating toxic contamination that threatens an entire community's ecological stability and public health. Margaret sat at the defendant's table in orange federal prison clothing, her chemical authority replaced by environmental conviction, and her pest management ideology revealed as systematic ecological terrorism. The woman who destroyed my research colonies was learning that federal environmental law provides serious protection for scientific research and severe consequences for people who commit ecological crimes. I continued my statement, addressing both court and broader issues of environmental protection that Margaret's case had exposed. Pollinators are essential to food security, ecosystem stability, and public health maintenance that affects millions of Americans. Margaret's systematic destruction of research infrastructure represents everything federal environmental law exists to prevent, including chemical terrorism targeting scientific progress and ecological conservation. Judge Martinez sentenced Margaret to 16 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with complete restitution of over $800,000 for environmental remediation, research reconstruction, and community ecological restoration. The sentence included forfeiture of all assets used in environmental crimes and lifetime prohibition from purchasing or applying restricted pesticides. The most satisfying aspect of Margaret's sentence was the community service requirement following her prison release. Judge Martinez specifically ordered Margaret to work at pollinator conservation organizations and environmental restoration projects, ensuring she'd spend years repairing the ecological damage her chemical terrorism had created throughout Georgia. The conviction and sentencing made national environmental news as suburban chemical terrorism escalated into major federal environmental crimes prosecution. Margaret Thompson became cautionary tale about ecological destruction, environmental crimes consequences, and federal protection for scientific research targeting environmental health threats. The broader impact extended far beyond individual justice for environmental crimes victims. The case established federal precedent for prosecuting systematic chemical terrorism as serious environmental crimes, leading to similar investigations nationwide, where suburban chemical obsession had destroyed beneficial insect populations and threatened ecosystem stability. The Environmental Protection Agency created new enforcement protocols for investigating residential chemical terrorism, while Congress held hearings on strengthening federal protection for pollinator research and environmental health infrastructure. Margaret's case became foundation for enhanced federal environmental crimes prosecution targeting systematic ecological destruction. Meadowbrook Estates underwent complete environmental transformation following Margaret's federal conviction. The new HOA Environmental Committee, established after community-wide recognition of chemical terrorism consequences, implemented organic land management policies that exceeded federal environmental protection requirements while supporting rather than destroying beneficial insect populations. The community culture changed dramatically as residents who'd suffered under Margaret's chemical terrorism began working together to create ecologically supportive environment where scientific research was protected rather than systematically destroyed. Annual pollinator festivals replaced Margaret's chemical warfare campaigns, while environmental education programs helped residents understand ecosystem connections. Most importantly, I've rebuilt my research colonies using improved monitoring systems that detect chemical contamination while providing enhanced protection against environmental terrorism. The 5 new installations incorporate federal security measures while maintaining the productive research capacity essential to understanding pollinator health and disease emergence patterns. The reconstructed research program serves dual purposes, continuing critical CDC environmental health investigation while providing educational opportunities for community members learning about pollinator conservation, ecosystem protection, and environmental crimes prevention. Every research finding contributes to national disease surveillance while demonstrating that environmental protection and scientific research can coexist successfully. The Pollinator Health Monitoring Program has expanded beyond residential research to include partnership with federal agencies investigating agricultural chemical impacts, climate change effects, and systematic factors contributing to beneficial insect population collapse throughout the southeastern United States. My CDC career has been enriched by understanding how environmental crimes prosecutions can protect scientific research from chemical terrorism while ensuring environmental health investigations receive federal protection. Margaret's case demonstrated that environmental criminals face serious consequences, while beneficial insect research deserves constitutional respect and criminal law enforcement. Margaret Thompson began serving her federal prison sentence at a minimum security facility designed for environmental criminals, where Chemical Terrorism Authority provides no protection from consequences of systematic ecological destruction. Her conviction serves as permanent reminder that environmental crimes carry serious federal penalties regardless of suburban setting or community chemical ideology. The ripple effects continue expanding as similar cases across America follow pollinator research precedent for federal prosecution of environmental crimes targeting scientific investigation. Every successful environmental prosecution makes future chemical terrorism less likely, while demonstrating that federal law provides meaningful protection for ecological research and beneficial insect conservation. 18 months after Margaret's federal conviction, I received a letter from a CDC colleague in California whose HOA had destroyed her air quality monitoring equipment through similar chemical terrorism targeting environmental health research. I connected her with federal environmental prosecutors and EPA investigators, leading to another successful prosecution that resulted in substantial criminal sentences and enhanced protection for atmospheric research. The California case established additional precedent for protecting environmental health research as federally protected scientific infrastructure, deserving enhanced criminal penalties for systematic destruction or chemical interference. The case demonstrated that pollinator research victory in Georgia was an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of environmental terrorism requiring aggressive federal enforcement. Standing in my rebuilt research apiary this evening, watching healthy bee colonies forage among native wildflowers while sunset light reflects off monitoring equipment that tracks pollinator health in real time, I'm reminded of why we fought so hard against Margaret's environmental terrorism, not just for scientific research protection, but for every ecosystem that deserves federal protection from chemical destruction. The research area represents more than pollinator conservation or environmental crimes prosecution victory. It symbolizes the principle that federal environmental law provides real protection for scientific research when communities fail to protect beneficial insects from systematic chemical terrorism, and that environmental crimes against research infrastructure will face serious federal consequences regardless of suburban chemical ideology. Pollinator research continues inspiring environmental scientists nationwide who face chemical harassment, research destruction, and community resistance to ecological investigation. The colonies demonstrate that federal environmental law can transform chemical terrorism into protected research when scientists refuse to accept ecological destruction as inevitable community chemical warfare. The evening air carries the sound of healthy bee colonies mixed with Georgia native bird songs and the peaceful hum of scientific equipment monitoring environmental health in real time. My research grows more productive each year, providing ongoing testament to pollinator conservation, supported by federal environmental protection and community ecological education. Most importantly, the CDC environmental health investigation continues through expanded pollinator monitoring, serving agricultural communities, urban environments, and suburban developments, where beneficial insect conservation requires federal protection from systematic chemical terrorism by residents who mistake ecological warfare for pest management. The transformation extends beyond individual research success to institutional change protecting environmental scientists throughout America and beyond. Pollinator research case demonstrated that chemical terrorism targeting federal research constitutes serious environmental crime deserving substantial punishment, while establishing legal precedent that continues protecting ecological investigation nationwide. Sometimes the most powerful environmental protection isn't found in chemical applications or pest control services, but in research colonies that demonstrate federal law can transform ecological terrorism into protected scientific investigation when environmental health investigators understand their federal rights and refuse to accept chemical destruction as acceptable community pest management. The research continues operating at full scientific capacity. Pollinator health monitoring serves communities throughout the Southeast, and federal environmental law provides ongoing protection for beneficial insect research facing chemical harassment. Margaret Thompson learned her lessons from federal prison, but environmental scientists learned that research infrastructure can overcome chemical terrorism when federal environmental crimes prosecution provides meaningful consequences for systematic ecological destruction. Standing here surrounded by thriving bee colonies that survive federal environmental crimes while producing scientific data critical to understanding disease emergence patterns, I'm grateful for federal environmental law protecting research infrastructure, community support that transformed chemical terrorism into ecological education, and pollinator conservation that continues serving environmental health investigation throughout America. The research represents victory over environmental terrorism and proof that scientific investigation survives chemical warfare when federal environmental crimes prosecution provides meaningful protection for ecological research, deserving respect rather than systematic destruction by suburban chemical terrorists who mistake pesticide applications for community environmental management. The ongoing legacy of this environmental crimes case continues expanding in ways that exceed the original research scope. The Federal Environmental Research Protection Act, legislation directly inspired by Margaret's prosecution, now provides enhanced criminal penalties for anyone targeting scientific research through chemical terrorism or systematic ecological destruction. The law has protected over 50 environmental research projects from chemical harassment, while establishing mandatory prison sentences for environmental terrorism. Educational programs have emerged from the Beehive case, with universities across America incorporating environmental crimes prosecution into mandatory curriculum for students studying environmental science, public health, and ecological conservation. The University of Georgia established the Pollinator Research Defense Fund, supporting scientists whose work faces chemical terrorism while providing legal resources for environmental crimes prosecution. International environmental organizations have adopted our case as a model for protecting ecological research from chemical harassment and systematic environmental terrorism. Delegations from the European Union, Canada, and Australia have studied how federal environmental crimes prosecution can protect scientific research while ensuring that ecological investigation receives constitutional protection rather than chemical destruction. The pollinator conservation movement has expanded globally, with several countries passing legislation specifically protecting beneficial insect research from chemical terrorism and residential pesticide abuse. The laws, collectively known as Beneficial Insect Protection Acts, provide legal frameworks that prevent environmental terrorism while ensuring that ecological research receives federal protection from systematic chemical harassment. Margaret Thompson's federal prison rehabilitation program became a model for environmental crimes education, demonstrating how systematic environmental terrorists can learn to respect ecological systems they previously targeted through chemical warfare. The program's success in reducing environmental recidivism has been adopted by federal prison systems nationwide. The community transformation in Meadowbrook Estates has become an international example of how ecological terrorism can be prevented through environmental education and federal environmental crimes enforcement. Environmental management companies from across the globe send representatives to study how chemical terrorism prevention can protect beneficial insect populations, while supporting rather than destroying ecological research. CDC epidemiologists from throughout the federal health system regularly visit the rebuilt research facility during disease surveillance conferences, sharing environmental health research and learning about pollinator health connections to emerging disease patterns. The facility has become an unofficial headquarters for federal environmental health researchers, seeking community support and ecological understanding. The therapeutic value of rebuilding scientific research after environmental terrorism has provided healing that extends beyond individual recovery to community-wide ecological awareness. Every research finding contributes to national environmental health surveillance while demonstrating that federal protection can transform chemical terrorism into protected scientific investigation, benefiting millions of Americans. Corporate partnerships have developed with major environmental organizations and ecological research foundations who provide funding and equipment for pollinator health monitoring at cost. Recognizing the community value and federal importance of protecting ecological research while serving environmental health investigation that prevents disease emergence through ecosystem protection. The annual research production has expanded to include collaboration with agricultural universities, environmental health agencies, and international pollinator conservation organizations, each contributing to global understanding of how chemical terrorism affects ecological health, while demonstrating that federal environmental crimes prosecution can protect research infrastructure from systematic destruction. Veteran environmental scientists have established mentorship programs using the Beehive case as example of how federal environmental law can protect ecological research from chemical harassment, creating training facilities that serve environmental health investigation, while teaching ecological research protection skills that connect participants to federal environmental protection and scientific community values. The federal environmental protection precedent, established by the Beehive case, has been cited in Supreme Court environmental briefs, congressional environmental testimony, and international ecological conferences, as example of how environmental research can be meaningfully protected through federal environmental crimes, prosecution, and enhanced criminal penalties for systematic ecological terrorism targeting scientific investigation. 5 years after Margaret's environmental terrorism and 4 years into her federal prison sentence, I received a letter from an environmental researcher in Oregon whose pollinator studies were being destroyed through similar chemical harassment. I connected her with federal environmental prosecutors and EPA criminal investigators, leading to another successful prosecution that expanded federal protection for ecological research nationwide. The Oregon case established additional precedent for protecting environmental health research as federally protected scientific infrastructure, while demonstrating that the Beehive terrorism victory in Georgia was part of a broader pattern of chemical harassment, requiring aggressive federal environmental crimes, enforcement, and systematic ecological protection. The evening air carries the sound of healthy pollinator colonies mixed with native wildlife recovering from years of chemical terrorism, while federal monitoring equipment records ecological restoration data that contributes to national environmental health surveillance. Margaret's chemical warfare has been replaced by thriving ecological systems that demonstrate how federal environmental protection can restore communities damaged by systematic pesticide abuse. The research facility continues operating beyond full capacity. Ecological health monitoring serves environmental agencies throughout the southeastern United States, and federal environmental crimes prosecution ensures that future environmental researchers can conduct scientific investigation without fear of chemical terrorism by community residents who mistake ecological warfare for pest management. Sometimes the most powerful environmental protection comes not from chemical applications or pesticide warfare, but from research facilities that demonstrate federal environmental law can transform systematic ecological terrorism into protected scientific investigation. When environmental health researchers understand their federal rights and communities choose ecological education over chemical destruction of beneficial insect populations, essential to environmental health and food security. The legacy continues through every research finding that protects public health, every pollinator colony that survives chemical harassment, every federal environmental crimes prosecution that protects ecological research, and every community that chooses environmental education over systematic chemical terrorism targeting scientific investigation that serves national environmental health surveillance and disease prevention through ecosystem protection. What's your experience with chemical harassment or environmental destruction in your community? Share your story in the comments below. I read every comment and respond to researchers facing similar challenges with federal environmental protection, resources, and EPA enforcement information. Don't let chemical terrorists destroy ecosystems that communities depend on for environmental health, food security, and scientific research that protects public health nationwide. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, and ring that notification bell for more HOA Revenge Stories where justice is served ice cold. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.